On the morning of June 7th, 1969, American soldiers walked out through their own wire in Tay Ninh Province and started counting bodies. They counted 323. Inside the base, across 3 nights of fighting, 1 American had been killed. The men who attacked Crook were not amateurs. They came from main force regiments that had fought in that province for years, and they came back a second night after watching what happened on the first. So how did some of the most experienced soldiers in that war end up dead in rows in front of 6 howitzers? 2 months before any of this, Fire Support Base Crook did not exist. It was flat ground about 400 feet across, roughly 14 kilometers northwest of Tay Ninh City, and about 10 kilometers from the Cambodian border. In April 1969, the 25th Infantry Division built a fire base on that spot, and the reason they picked it is the whole story. That ground sat across one of the busiest enemy infiltration routes in the country, the corridor that moved troops and supplies back and forth between War Zone C and the sanctuaries inside Cambodia. Dropping a fire base onto it choked the route. But it did something else too, and the Army's own official history is remarkably blunt about what that something was. The plan, in its words, assumed that the enemy would not be able to resist an attempt to knock out the isolated post. Read that sentence again and you understand what Crook actually was. It was bait. A small, isolated, apparently vulnerable outpost, parked deliberately on ground the enemy could not afford to lose, and built by people who very much wanted it to be attacked. The garrison was not large. Company B of the 3rd Battalion, 22nd Infantry, a unit that called itself the Regulars. Battery A of the 7th Battalion, 11th Artillery, with 6 105mm howitzers. A mortar platoon, communications, medics. Somewhere between 120 and 200 infantrymen, and 60 or so artillerymen. Against that, in June 1969, came regiments. Before we get to the attacks, you need to see what the defenders had built, because almost every video about this battle skips it, and then acts surprised by the result. Bulldozers cleared the fields of fire around Crook. Standard practice. But the engineers deliberately left isolated patches of cover standing. Those patches were left there to attract enemy scouts and observers, and every one of them was positioned so that ground radar covered it exactly and direct. Howitzer fire was already laid on it. If you used the cover, you had walked into a pre-registered kill box. Then, they cut 2 concentric circles into the ground around the base, like racetracks, at 100 to 150 meters, and at 300 meters. Those had 2 jobs. They denied rocket-propelled grenade gunners the firing positions they wanted, and from the air they worked as a built-in range scale. So a pilot and a man on the bunker line were reading the same distances off the same landmarks. Buried out beyond the wire were seismic sensors, the same family of devices being used on the barrier system up north, listening for footsteps. On the tower sat ground surveillance radar. On the line, starlight scopes and infrared night observation devices. Overhead, when it was needed, Nighthawk helicopters carrying xenon searchlights. And the guns themselves had a technique the 25th Division Artillery had developed for exactly this situation. It was called Killer Junior. You take a high explosive shell, set a mechanical time fuse so it detonates about 30 feet above the ground, somewhere between 200 and 1,000 meters out, and fire it flat. What you get is not a crater. You get a ceiling of steel fragments coming down over the wire, and unlike a flechette round, it reaches men who are crawling or lying flat in a ditch. And Crook was never fighting alone. Several neighboring fire bases had their guns ranged onto its approaches, so an attack on one small outpost pulled in the artillery of a whole network, plus Cobra gunships on call. That is the part that makes the arithmetic so brutal. The attackers were not assaulting 6 howitzers and a rifle company. They were assaulting everything within range of 6 howitzers and a rifle company. Everything was in place at Crook. The people who built it just did not know yet what everything was building toward. For weeks, it was quiet. Out there. Patrols went out. Patrols came back. Nothing much happened. That ended on the evening of June 5th. The seismic sensors picked up heavy movement less than a kilometer to the northwest. Then, the radar found small groups moving in the woodlines. Running the defense that night was Major Joseph Valesko, executive officer of the 3rd of the 22nd. He put interdicting artillery onto the movement, and he put the base at 100% alert. Nobody at Crook was asleep when it started. At 2:55 in the morning, the sky came apart. Rockets, 75mm recoilless rifle fire, rocket-propelled grenades, 60 and 82mm mortars. Most of the rockets flew long and landed past the base. One mortar round did not. Private First Class William Michael Crusie Jr., 21 years old, from Wappingers Falls, New York, had just come back in from a 3-man listening post barely 50 meters outside the perimeter. He was killed by mortar fragments at around 3 in the morning. He is on panel 23 West, line 84. He was awarded the Silver Star. Then the ground attack came, a battalion-sized assault out of the south and the west. A 16-man sapper team got through the outer wire with Bangalore torpedoes, which is exactly what sappers were supposed to do, and it is where the plan stopped working for them. Riflemen in the bunkers stopped them inside the wire. The bunker line itself was never penetrated. By 4 in the morning, everything the Americans had was overhead. Tactical air alongside AC-47 Spooky and AC-119 Shadow, with helicopter gunships working the tree lines. Around 15 enemy heavy machine guns opened up trying to drive the aircraft off, and were hunted down one by one. Inside the wire, Captain Richard Neal's gun crews were working their howitzers in the open while the base was still taking incoming. He said afterwards that even at the height of it, his men came out of their bunkers and got the guns firing, and that they came out of the whole thing having taken very few casualties. At first light, they swept the ground outside the wire and counted 76 enemy dead and 15 weapons. And that was only round 1. If you want more of these, built from the actual after-action reports instead of recycled from other videos, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep doing the digging. Now, back to the second night, because the second night is the one that made Crook famous. Enter Major John Bode, a United States Air Force forward air controller, attached to the 1st Brigade of the 25th Division. Over these days, he flew 6 missions and more than 17 hours at treetop level, in and out of overcast, sitting below 1,000 feet, day and night, running every Air Force and Army air asset that came into the fight. He was awarded the Air Force Cross for it. At 2 in the morning on June 7th, a Nighthawk helicopter caught large groups of men moving along the road east of the base. Artillery went onto them immediately. At 3 came the barrage. At around 4:30, 2 battalions hit the northern side of the base at once, from the northeast and the northwest. The northwest attack got into the outer wire before it was stopped. The northeast attack never reached the wire at all. On that northeast side was Specialist 4 Richard Marroquin from Floresville, Texas, on an M60. He said he saw them coming, that the place was lit up like the 4th of July, and they could pick out targets as the enemy came out of the woodline. 12 of them went down in front of his position, and this is where the design of the place did its work. The attackers had committed in the open, in ground that had been surveyed, cleared, ringed, and pre-registered months earlier, under illumination, with airburst artillery walking over them and gunships overhead. When they broke and pulled back, most of them were still in that open ground. The morning sweep on June 7th counted 323 dead, 10 prisoners, more than 40 weapons, including 2 machine guns and 2 mortars. 3 Americans were wounded that night. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Carmichael, the battalion commander, said his support elements gave them everything they needed as fast as it could possibly be done. and that Alpha, Charlie, and Delta companies all ended up in it, sweeping the woodlines afterwards. Captain Larry Thomas, who ran Bravo Company, back and forth along the bunker line both nights. Put it more simply, they were all heroes. Here's where this channel has to be honest with you, because the version of this battle circulating online is cleaner than the truth. That figure of roughly 400 enemy dead is the sum of 2 morning body counts. Body counts were the central measure of progress in that war, and they are one of the best documented statistical problems of the entire conflict. When retired Brigadier General Douglas Kinnard surveyed Army generals who had commanded in Vietnam, 61% of them said the count was often inflated.
It was mainly an NVA operation, and they were very well equipped. We actually confronted enemy soldiers that were as detailed uniform as we were. Knives, compass, backpack, extra ammo, rifle, pistol if you were an officer, those kind of things. So they had RPGs, primarily the 7s in our area. Their machine guns were very deadly. The AK-47 is an awesome round. The FKS carbine, all effective rounds.
That is a man who fought the same enemy in the same division on the same border. And it matters because the lazy version of this story treats the attackers as if they walked into the guns out of stupidity. They did not. They were main force regiments of the 9th Division, the 271st, the 272nd, and the 88th, and their orders were part of a real campaign. The 25th Division's own operational report describes an enemy summer offensive aimed at Tay Ninh City, with border installations like Crook to be dealt with in the opening stages. They were not throwing lives away for nothing. They were trying to clear a road they needed against a position that had been engineered specifically to make that impossible, and the price of finding that out was catastrophic. 2 corrections while we are here. You will see videos claiming the attackers were the North Vietnamese 33rd Regiment. No primary source supports that. The documented units are the ones just named. You will also see the total given as exactly 402. That precise number traces back to an AI-written encyclopedia page, not to any record. In this particular case, the counts are stronger than most. These were physical bodies on ground the Americans swept in daylight, and they came with 10 prisoners and more than 40 captured weapons sitting alongside them, which is a much harder thing to invent than a number radioed in from a tree line. So the ratio is real, and it is genuinely one of the most lopsided defensive actions of the war. The decimal point precision is not. Trust the shape of the number, not the last digit. The third night, June 7th into the 8th, is the one the title of this video has to be careful about. There was no ground assault. Small arms and mortar fire came in. The base answered with airstrikes, artillery, gunships, Spooky and Shadow, and it stopped after about 2 hours. Nobody was hurt. The official history calls it little more than a parting gesture from a badly beaten regiment. So it was 3 consecutive nights of attack, but 2 real battles and 1 gesture. That distinction is not a technicality. It is the difference between an enemy that kept coming and an enemy that had already been broken and was covering its withdrawal. And one more name because almost nobody includes it. That famous count of 1 American killed refers to the men inside the firebase. On June 6th, Alpha Company went out on a reconnaissance in force to cut off the retreating enemy. Specialist 4 Joseph Valesko Jr. assaulted an enemy machine gun position and was killed doing it. He received the Silver Star. He is on panel 23 West, line 80. 2 men, not 1. It is a small correction. It is also the kind that matters to 2 families. Major Hachia was asked afterwards what made the difference. He did not talk about the guns. He said the real key was early warning, that the electronic devices had the enemy zeroed several hours before they ever reached the perimeter, that they knew they were coming and they were ready for them. Which is true, and it is also why one detail sits so badly. William Crusie had spent that night lying in the grass 50 meters outside the wire, being the early warning. He made it back inside. He was killed a few minutes later by a mortar round in the one place everybody assumed was safe. If you want the battle where a fire base in the same province was very nearly overrun instead, the Soy Tray video is on screen now. Thanks for watching.